I wasn't in a good place that fall, and saying it plain is still easier than saying all the ways it showed. My name is Travis Thornton. I was 38, signed legal papers with a pen that felt heavier than it should, and drove 2 hours up into my grandfather's timber acreage with my hound in the passenger seat, and a headache behind both eyes that never quite left. 12 years at the mill had trained me to keep moving, keep nodding, keep taking the extra shift, and by then, I'd done it so long, I couldn't tell discipline from damage. When my separation became official, people said kind things in careful voices, but what I heard was the hum of fluorescent lights and paperwork, and my own name on forms I didn't want. I told everyone the same thing. I needed a month to patch the old elk camp roof, sort tools, and put the property on the market before snow. It sounded practical. Practical was the only language I trusted. The road up Coldwater Creek narrowed to broken gravel and old logging ruts that had turned hard as fired clay after a dry September. Fir and cedar leaned over the track in places, and the truck mirror brushed branches that smelled like clean sap and cold dust. Mabel, my red bone hound, stood with her front paws on the armrest whenever we climbed the last switchbacks. She whined once when the cabin came into view, low and uncertain, then settled as if she recognized the place from my stories, even though she'd never been. The cabin looked worse than memory. One corner of the porch had dropped 3 inches. Moss had swallowed the north side shingles. The stovepipe listed a little like an old man favoring one knee. Still, the place held itself the way old men do, with quiet pride and no complaints. My grandfather built most of it with a handsaw, a borrowed mule, and the stubbornness our family passed down like eye color. I cut the engine and sat there longer than I needed. You could hear the creek a quarter-mile down slope if the wind was right, and that day it came up soft through the trees, like someone turning pages in another room. I put my forehead against the steering wheel and tried to pray, because prayer had always been my grandfather's first tool and his last one. I got 3 words in before my thoughts scattered. Static. That was the only word for it. I felt silly and angry at the same time, which is a hard mix to carry. Mabel licked my elbow because that dog had no patience for a man hiding in a parked truck. "Yeah, all right," I told her. "We're doing this." I unloaded in a rhythm I understood. Fuel can, duffel, tool tote, folding cot, dog food, grain sack for the old pen, even though there were no goats anymore. The cabin door stuck halfway open until I put my shoulder into it. Inside smelled like wood smoke trapped in dry boards and mouse nests in the wall. Grandad's enamel coffee pot still hung above the sink on the same nail. His wool jacket was gone. My father had taken it years before. The absence hit harder than I expected. I set my bag down and stood still in the dim light from the west window, listening to the building settle around me. Every board had a memory attached to it, and most of those memories ended with his laugh, soft and gravelly, when I'd done something clumsy. By the first week of October, mornings at that elevation carried a thin white mist that sat waist-high among the fir trunks until the sun got above the ridge. I woke before dawn, out of habit, lit the stove, and brewed coffee black enough to stand a spoon in. The first sip tasted like burnt bark and comfort. I went outside in my work gloves and stared at the roofline while Mabel made loops around the clearing, stopping every few yards to inspect chipmunks she never once caught. Repair list in my head, pencil behind my ear, shoulders tight all the way to my jaw. It should have felt like purpose. Instead, it felt like punishment I'd assigned myself because I didn't know what else to do with all the noise in my chest. My phone found one bar near the woodpile, so that's where I stood for calls. Around 8 that first morning, my sister Leah rang. "You there?" she said. I could hear office chatter behind her and a copier feeding pages. Yeah, you made it okay. Truck made it. Cabin's still standing. Mostly. She paused. Dad said you're planning to stay alone the whole month. That's the plan. Trav, I know you want space, but space and isolation aren't the same thing. I scraped mud off my boot with a stick. I'm fine, Leah. You say that like you're reading it off a card. I'm working. That helps. Does it? I looked at Mabel rolling in dry needles like she'd discovered a new religion. Ask me in a week. Leah exhaled, soft through the line. Call me every other day. Not optional. Bossy. Family trait. You started it. That got a small laugh out of me. Rusty, but real. I'll call. Good. And Travis? Yeah? You don't have to earn rest. The line crackled once and dropped to silence after we hung up. I kept the phone in my hand a while longer, staring at my own reflection in the black screen. Work took the edge off for short stretches. I stripped rotten shingles, replaced 2 rafters over the porch, and swapped out a cracked window pane in the back room. My hands remembered what to do long before my mind did. Measure, mark, cut, set, secure. Every task had a beginning and an end, a clean standard, a way to know if you'd done it right. That steadiness had always been the mill's comfort too, even when it was grinding me down. At noon I ate standing up, usually canned stew from a tin cup and stale crackers from the glove box. Mabel got better food than I did and knew it. At dusk, the mountain shifted into blue-grey shadow, and that was the hard hour. Daylight gave me instructions. Night gave me memory. I'd sit at the small table by the stove, grandfather's pocket knife in my palm, thumb moving over the worn bone scales, and all the conversations I never had would line up in my head. The one with my ex-wife where I admitted I'd been absent even while living in the same house. The one with my father where I said I was tired before my body forced the truth. The one with my grandfather where I asked him how to carry grief without turning it into anger at every living thing. He'd been gone 4 years and still took up the safest room in me. On the 3rd evening, I found his old field notebook in a drawer under rusted fishing lures and a single brass compass that still pointed true. The notebook smelled faintly of cedar oil and smoke. Most pages were weather notes, game trails, dates, and practical little sketches of fence repairs. Halfway through, tucked between inventory lists, he'd written one line in block letters. Quiet is also company if you let it be. I read that sentence 3 times and shut the book because I felt my throat close up. I went outside, leaned against the porch post, and watched the treetops darken. Mabel came and pressed against my shin. I put my hand on her warm neck and stayed there until the stars came out sharp enough to hurt. Sleep came in short pieces. I'd drift off to the stove ticking and wake an hour later with my heart running hard, for no reason I could name. Sometimes I dreamed I was late for a shift that never ended, conveyor belts rolling, and my supervisor shouting numbers over machine noise. Sometimes I dreamed I was back in my kitchen at home, 2 coffee mugs on the counter out of habit, and one stayed cold no matter how long I waited. After each one, I sat up in the dark and counted breaths like a man learning to do basic math again. Inhale 4, hold 4, out 6. It worked eventually, though not gracefully. One afternoon, rain came in slantwise through the trees, fine and steady, and pinned us indoors. I sharpened broadheads I no longer planned to use and organized coffee cans of screws by size, because order gave me a little relief. Around 3, my phone buzzed with a number from the mill. I almost let it go to voicemail, then answered. "Thornton," I said. "Travis, it's Cole from scheduling. You still good for Tuesday night next week?" I laughed once without humour. "Cole, I filed leave." Right. Sorry, we're short again, and your name popped up on overtime rotation." "That figures." He hesitated. You okay out there? I watched rain bead and run down the window glass. I don't know yet. Fair answer. You want me to keep your name off the list till end of month? Yes. Done. Take care of yourself, man. After the call, I stood in the doorway and let the damp air cool my face. It struck me then how much of my life had been name on a list. Shift list, maintenance list, legal list, debt list, things I failed at list. Up there, rain tapping the roof, no one needed me for production numbers or signatures. That freedom should have felt good. At first, it felt like falling. I started a routine anyway. Wake at 5:30, stove, coffee, feed Mabel, roof work till noon, walk the south boundary after lunch, split a half cord, simple dinner, notebook by lamplight, bed by 10. I wrote down practical things at first because feelings looked foolish on paper. Pipe seam needs reseal. Replace hinge on tool chest. Check lower fence posts before frost. On the 5th day, I added one line that had nothing to do with repairs. I am tired of pretending I'm not hurt. I stared at it long enough for the ink to dry dull. That night, the sky cleared. Cold settled early and hard, enough to silver the grass by the time I banked the stove. I stepped onto the porch in socks and watched my breath rise and fade. Down the slope, Coldwater Creek kept talking to itself in the dark. Mabel sat beside me, leaning her shoulder against my knee, both of us facing the trees like we were waiting for a train that didn't run this far anymore. I didn't feel fixed. I didn't feel hopeful exactly. I felt present, which had been rare for a long while. For a man who'd spent years running from quiet, that was a beginning. I stayed on the porch until the cold reached through my socks and found the bones in my feet. Mabel finally stood, stretched long through her back legs, and looked over her shoulder at the cabin door, like she was reminding me we were not wild creatures, no matter how romantic I wanted misery to sound in my head. I gave the trees one last look and followed her in, barred the door out of habit, and banked the stove down to a low, orange glow. The cot creaked when I sat. My knees ached from roofing work, my hands smelled like wet pine pitch, and my chest held that same dull pressure like somebody had set a toolbox on it and forgotten it there. I remember thinking, right then, that people talked about heartbreak like it was sharp. Mine wasn't sharp. Mine was heavy. I slept in fragments again. At one point I woke to the stovepipe ticking and the kind of silence that made every small sound in the cabin seem too loud. The rustle of Mabel turning circles in her blanket, wind brushing the eaves, my own breath catching when another dream snapped off halfway through. I sat up, pulled the wool blanket around my shoulders, and waited for my pulse to settle. In the dark, my grandfather's line from the notebook came back clear as if he'd said it from the next room. Quiet is also company if you let it be. I wanted to believe him. I also wanted a voice on the other end of the room saying, "You're doing fine, boy." Both felt out of reach that hour. By sunrise, the mist had laid itself thick between the fir trunks, a low white drift that made the clearing look like it floated separate from the ridge. I fed Mabel, drank coffee off the stove, then took my hammer and pry bar to the porch corner that had sunk. Work gave me a script and a pace. Dig out rotten beam, cut replacement, square it, tap it in, test the load. My shoulders loosened while I moved. They tightened again each time I stopped long enough to hear my own thoughts. Around mid-morning, I found myself standing still with a nail between my lips, staring at the tree line with no idea how long I'd been doing it. Not looking for anything, just not wanting to turn back toward the empty doorway. I forced myself onto the south boundary walk after lunch, same as I'd written in the notebook. The trail dropped through mixed cedar and alder, then opened along a narrow shelf where you could see Coldwater Creek flashing silver through the bottoms. Ground was soft from the prior rain, and the air carried that rich, wet smell of needles, mud, and old bark. Mabel usually ranged ahead in loops, nose down, ears up, reporting on every squirrel and phantom threat, like a tiny sheriff with no badge and strong opinions. That day she stayed close enough to brush my knee every dozen steps. Twice she looked up at me as if checking whether I was still in my own skin. I told her she was nosy. She took that as praise. At the lower meadow fence, I knelt to inspect a split post and felt a wave of tiredness so sudden it almost tipped me sideways. Not sleep-tired, soul-tired. I sat right there in damp grass and let the feeling roll through. The creek kept its steady talk below. A hawk circled over the far ridge. Somewhere behind me, a branch dropped with a soft crack and thud. Ordinary mountain sounds, all of them. Still, I said out loud, to nobody in particular, I don't know what I'm doing anymore. The words looked small once they were out, but they were true. I had spent so long being useful that I didn't know who I was when usefulness ran out. That evening, I heated canned chili and cornbread from a skillet that never quite sat flat, then ate on the porch steps with Mabel pressed against my leg. Dusk came in layers, gold at the top of the ridge, then grey under the trees, then blue settling into every hollow. I took out my phone where the signal sometimes appeared by the woodpile and saw one bar blink to life. I called my father, then nearly hung up when he answered on the second ring. Trav? Yeah, it's me. You all right? I watched mist climb out of the creek cut and disappear. I'm standing up and breathing. That's where we are. He waited, giving me room the way he did when he didn't trust himself to speak first. Need me to come up? No, not yet. All right, I'll keep the truck gassed anyway. Dad? Yeah. I found Grandad's notebook. A long pause, then a rough little laugh. He wrote like he talked, half weather report, half sermon. That sounds right. You eat supper? Mostly. Feed that dog? She's thriving. Then you did enough for one day. After we hung up, I stood with the dark phone in my hand and felt a small, steadying warmth that had nothing to do with the stove. No grand reconciliation, no speeches. Just my father keeping the truck ready. 3 mornings later, by the second week of October, rain moved through before dawn and left the world rinsed clean and bright. I stepped out with my mug and found the clearing jewelled with drops, each grass blade carrying one cold bead of light. Mabel trotted to the edge of camp, stopped near the big fir stump I used as a table, and sat down with her tail sweeping slow across the wet needles. Not stiff, not alert, calm as church. Her ears were relaxed, mouth slightly open, eyes fixed into the trees, as if she saw a familiar neighbor taking his time down the trail. I followed her gaze and heard nothing but distant water and one raven far off. Then I noticed what she was sitting beside. 3 river stones lay on top of the stump, clean and damp, arranged in a neat crossed marker. Not random, not kicked together by chance. 2 dark flat stones made the crossbar and spine, and a smaller pale one sat at centre where they met, balanced with a care that took deliberate fingers. My breath caught so hard it hurt. My grandfather had used that exact marker on hunting days when he wanted to signal he'd passed through, and all was well. Crossed stones meant safe trail, no trouble, keep going. He used to leave them on logs near the north draw when I was too young to track farther than camp. I set my mug down and walked a slow circle around the stump, boots sinking in soaked duff. No nearby boot prints, no tire tracks in the clearing beyond mine. Rain had flattened most surface marks, but the stones themselves carried a faint, freshly washed gleam, not the chalky film they'd wear after a day in open air. Mabel stayed seated, tail still sweeping, as if this was the least dramatic event of our week. I crouched beside her and felt my own face doing something between a smile and a wince. "Well," I told her, "I've officially become the kind of man who receives emotional counseling from decorative rocks." She leaned into my shoulder and sighed, which I took as agreement. I picked up the pale center stone first. It was smooth and cool, about the size of a walnut, with one rust-colored stripe around the middle like a belt. Water clung to my palm from it. I turned it over twice, then set it back exactly where it had been, and stepped away. My mind moved fast through every practical explanation I could assemble. A neighbor checking on the place. Some old hunter with a sense of humor. Leah sending a friend to make sure I hadn't gone feral. Each idea fell apart under one plain detail. Nobody who didn't know my grandfather would have used that marker. Nobody who knew him well enough to use it would have come and gone without leaving a boot print, a note, a truck sound, something human and clumsy. The forest around us held a deep stillness, but it didn't feel empty. It felt attentive. Birdsong had thinned, as it does after rain, yet the quiet had shape to it, like a room where someone respectful is waiting for you to finish speaking. I stood there long enough for my coffee to go lukewarm on the stump. Mabel never barked once. She kept watching the same line of trees with soft eyes and a loose jaw, then finally rose, sniffed the air, and came back to press against my shin. I reached back to the stump, lifted the pale center stone again, and turned it once in my hand. I slipped the small pale stone into my jacket pocket. Not to prove anything, not yet. Maybe just to carry the question with me where I couldn't pretend I hadn't seen it. I left the two darker stones crossed on the stump, square and careful, exactly as they'd been placed. Then I went about the day's chores with that quiet marker at my back and a strange, reluctant lightness in my chest that made no practical sense at all. That night, for the first time since I came up the mountain, I slept longer than 2 hours without waking. I woke in the dark with my blanket still over both shoulders and my heart not racing for once. The stove had gone down to a soft red bed of coals, and Mabel was sprawled on her side, paws twitching in some happy dog dream. I lay there a minute, listening to the cabin hold its own silence, and felt that heavy toolbox pressure in my chest had shifted just enough to notice. Not gone. Just set down a little crooked instead of square on my ribs. Outside, dawn came pale and cold, with a strip of clean sky over the east ridge and beads of water hanging from every fir tip. I stepped off the porch and stopped. Under the tarp by the wood rack sat a fresh stack of split dry fir, ends lined up neat, shoulder high, covered from the weather with one of my spare oilcloths I knew I had left folded inside the shed. I stood there with my coffee cup halfway to my mouth, trying to remember if I'd done that yesterday and forgotten. I hadn't. Yesterday, that corner held wet rounds and bark peel. Nothing else. I set my cup down on the stump and walked over slow, like moving too fast might change what I was looking at. The wood was dry clear through. Not just surface dry, not it sat through one windy afternoon dry. Ready to burn dry. The splits were clean, mostly fir with a little alder mixed in, and each piece had been stacked with the bark side out so rain would run off. My grandfather used to do it that way. So did I after him. Plenty of people stack wood that way, I told myself. But standing there with my fingers on those dry ends, I could feel my practical mind flipping through explanations like index cards and rejecting each one on detail. No truck noise in the night, no boot prints in the soft edge mud by the rack, no dropped kindling, no cigarette butt, no sign of somebody in a hurry. Just the wood, done careful. Mabel trotted up, sniffed once at the stack, then looked past me toward the trees with that same easy expression she'd had at the stone marker. Tail sweeping slow, ears loose. She huffed through her nose and leaned into my thigh, more companion than alarm. If you've lived with a nervous hound, you learn the difference between "I heard something wrong" and "someone is nearby and I'm fine about it." She was very fine about it. "All right," I said to no one I could see. "Thank you, I guess." The words made me laugh under my breath because there I was in an old thermal shirt, thanking the timber for a mysterious delivery, like a man who'd finally slipped one bolt loose upstairs. I actually tipped my coffee cup toward the trees, as if etiquette applied. If anybody had filmed it, Leah would have had enough material to tease me until retirement. I worked through the morning with that stack at my back, repaired a hinge on the shed door, resealed the stovepipe collar, sorted a crate of rusted trap hardware I hadn't touched in years. Every now and then I'd glance up, expecting to catch movement at the tree line, and find only drifting mist and straight trunks. Curiosity kept nudging through the grief. Not loud, just persistent. It felt like a hand at my shoulder, turning me gently towards something I didn't yet understand. By late afternoon, the sky darkened and gave us another cold rain, steady enough to turn the trail down to the lower meadow slick. I pulled on my waxed jacket anyway and checked the old snare line my grandfather had set mostly for nuisance coyotes around lambing season. I hadn't planned to keep it active, but habit had me inspecting everything that could break before winter. The third anchor point by the alder run was tripped. Wire stretched, peg twisted. I swore, expecting to find fur or worse, then stopped. The snare loop had been opened and unwound, not snapped. The twisted section was straightened nearly perfect, then recoiled around the stake in two deliberate turns, like somebody had taken the time to undo a knot rather than tear through it. The drag marks in the mud were light, almost careful, and led 3 yards before disappearing in leaf litter. Whatever had hit it got free without panic, or had been freed. I crouched in the wet rain tapping my hood and touched the wire with 2 fingers. It was warm from my hand in a second and felt absurdly human to sit there talking to a piece of metal. But I did it anyway. "You don't like these," I said quietly. Mabel stood behind me, not straining forward, not growling, just waiting. I pulled the whole snare, coiled it, and carried it back uphill. At the shed, I hung it on a nail and left it there. If that was coincidence, fine. If it wasn't, message received. That night, I got 1 bar by the woodpile and called Leah because I'd promised. She answered on the first ring, voice bright in that way people use when they're trying not to crowd you. "You alive up there?" Still ugly, still upright. I'll mark both as progress. I looked toward the dark trees while I talked. Question. You send anybody up here to check on me? What? No, why? Just odd stuff. Wood got stacked. No sign who did it. She paused, then lowered her voice like somebody at her office had walked by. Could be your neighbor off the county spur. What's his name, Martin? Marty Keene. He liked your granddad, right? Yeah. Maybe he saw your truck and figured you'd need dry wood. Maybe. You gonna ask him? I can. Do that before you decide woodland spirits adopted you. Leah. I'm serious about one thing, she said, softer now. You sound more awake. After we hung up, I called Marty from the same patch of signal. He took a while to answer and sounded out of breath, like I'd caught him walking up his own driveway. Thornton Place, he said when he recognized my number. You hanging in? Trying. Hey, did you come by my camp this morning? Nope. Haven't been above the bridge in a week. Front axle's acting up, and I'm not risking that road till I fix it. You sure? Trav, I'm sure. Why? Found dry wood stacked under my tarp. Thought maybe you. He gave a low whistle. Wish it was me. I could use whoever did yours at my place. We talked another minute about weather moving in early, then hung up. External explanation closed. Clean as that. I stood in the dark with my phone in my pocket and listened to the creek talking below the ridge. 3 days passed after that call, and a rhythm set in that I didn't plan but started trusting. At dawn, Mabel would eat, then lead me on the south trail. Halfway to the lower bend, she'd stop at the same place where 2 cedar roots crossed like knuckles, lift her head uphill and wait maybe 10 seconds with her ears relaxed. Then she'd keep walking. No barking, no bristle. Just a pause, like acknowledging someone patient standing out of sight. The first morning, I wrote it off. The second morning, I marked it in the notebook. The third, I stopped with her and looked where she looked. There was never much to see. A darker strip among dark trunks, ferns settling after some weight passed. Once, a branch swayed when no wind touched the rest. I'm not a mystical man. I ran those details through practical filters until the filters tore. Elk, wrong height and movement. Bear, too upright, too measured, and no scent that made Mabel tense. Person. Nobody I knew could move that quietly through wet understory at that size. I told myself this couldn't be real. I told myself stress bends perception, grief adds shadows where there aren't any, and too much solitude can make a mailbox post look philosophical. All true in their place. But the place I was standing kept offering plain, physical answers to each excuse. Something big was using that slope. Something big knew exactly how to avoid spooking us. Something big seemed to be choosing courtesy. On the 4th evening after the stacked wood, the light went copper around 6, and the temperature dropped hard enough that my breath showed when I crossed the clearing. I'd promised myself I'd carry a sack of grain to the old goat pen and check the latch before dark, so I swung the bag over one shoulder and headed down the spur trail with Mabel trotting ahead. The pens sat in a shallow bowl ringed by cedar and young hemlock. Split-rail fence mostly intact except where one corner leaned. Grandad had kept 2 storm goats there years ago, mostly stubborn creatures that ate tin labels and acted offended by weather. Halfway down, Mabel slowed at her cedar root paws, then moved on without looking at me this time. At the pen, she sniffed the gate, circled once, and sat facing the upslope timber. Calm, waiting. The woods were quiet in that evening way when day birds settle, and night sounds haven't started yet. Not dead quiet, layered quiet. Water somewhere below, one drip from a bough, my own jacket brushing dry grass. I unshouldered the grain and set it by the post, then felt that prickle on the back of my neck that says you're not alone. Not threat, just presence. I turned toward the cedar stand above the pen. He was there, 40 yards, maybe a touch more, between 2 trunks wide as barrels. At first, my mind broke him into pieces because the hole didn't fit. Dark, vertical mass, slope of shoulder, one forearm thick as a fence rail resting near his side. Then my eyes adjusted to the light, and the shape came together. 8 feet, maybe 9, broad through the chest, covered in dark fur that caught a dull bronze edge where the low sun reached through branches. The head sat low between heavy shoulders, not hunched in menace, just built powerful and compact. He stood still as a stump and somehow more present than anything else in the clearing. I couldn't move for a second. I didn't run either. My body did that old adrenaline spark and then settled because nothing in his posture read aggression. Weight balanced, arms loose, chin slightly lowered, not squared at me. Watchful, yes. Gentle in the way a big draft horse is gentle when it decides where to place each hoof. Mabel got up, took 5 easy steps toward him, sniffed the air, and sat again. No bark, no tuck tail, no warning growl. Just sat. I heard my own voice come out rough and quiet. Evening. He didn't answer, of course. He shifted his weight and took one deliberate step backward into thinner shadow, as if making room for me. It was the same social move a respectful stranger makes on a narrow aisle. I see you. You can pass. That one step did more to steady me than anything else in that moment. Whatever I was seeing, it knew the shape of not crowding. My grandfather had said one odd line about mountain stories when I was maybe 12, and I hadn't thought of it in years. If you ever meet him, you'll know by how gentle the woods get. Standing there with grain dust on my gloves and my heart thudding in my throat, that sentence rose up complete and settled right where disbelief had been. I wanted to catalogue details, prove something, gather evidence like a sober adult. Instead, I stood with my hands open at my sides and felt tears push hot behind my eyes for reasons bigger than fear. I wanted to run, but something made me stay. Not paralysis, choice. I knew somehow that I wasn't in danger. The feeling had weight to it. He stayed another handful of breaths, eyes on me in a steady amber brown that looked older than any argument in my head. Then he turned a little, one shoulder angling away, and moved upslope through the cedars with a control that didn't match his size. No crashing, no display. Branches flexed and settled behind him. In 3 seconds, he was mostly shadow. In 5, gone. The clearing held after he left, like sound itself took a moment to return. Mabel trotted back to me and leaned hard against my leg. I set my hand on her head and realized it was shaking. We stood there in the dimming light until my breathing evened out. I finished at the pen because chores still mattered and because normal actions kept me anchored. I checked the latch, poured the grain into a dry bin, and tightened a loose rail with the fencing pliers from my pocket. On the top post, I set one small, dark riverstone I'd picked up near the creek that morning. Not arranged, just placed where it wouldn't fall. A quiet reply to a conversation I was only beginning to hear. Back at the cabin, full dark already in the trees, I lit the lamp, fed Mabel, and opened the notebook with hands that had finally stopped trembling. I wrote exactly what happened, line by line, while it was fresh. Distance to Treeline, light conditions, Mabel's behaviour, step backward, direction of travel. I even sketched the cedar pair where he'd stood and marked my position by the gate. I tucked the pale centre stone beside the page for a moment, then put it back in my pocket and closed the cover. I sat there a long time with the lamp humming low and the stove giving off steady heat, listening to the mountains settle around us. Grief was still in the room. Shame too. But curiosity had taken a chair at the table and wonder was no longer hypothetical. I sat with the notebook closed under my palm and listened until the lamp hissed down and the stove settled to a low, ticking heat. My first clear thought was that I needed to sleep before I turned one true thing into 10 bad guesses. My second thought was that sleep would not come easy now that the mountain had looked back at me. I stretched out on the cot anyway, boots by the door, jacket hanging from a nail, and stared at the rafters while Mabel snored in brief, whistling bursts. I ran the scene again and again, trying to force it into something ordinary. A trick of low light, a big black bear standing uphill at an odd angle, a hunter in heavy gear, stress and loneliness making me see scale wrong. Each explanation worked for about 3 seconds, then fell apart on detail. Bears do not step backward to give you room like a polite neighbour at the feed store. Hunters do not move uphill through wet cedar without one branch snap or muttered curse. My mind kept reaching for an old shelf to put this on, and there was no shelf. Sometime after midnight, I gave up on sleep and sat at the table in my thermal shirt with a cup of reheated coffee that tasted like burnt pennies. I opened Grandad's notebook to the weather pages and found a margin note I hadn't paid much attention to before. If he's close, dear, don't panic. They watch, no date, no explanation. Just that, written in his block hand like he was labeling screws in a jar. I traced the letters once with my thumb and shut the cover hard enough to rattle the spoon in my cup. By morning, thin frost silvered the porch rail, and the sky had that brittle blue you get right before a weather turn. I walked straight to the goat pen after feeding Mabel, not because it was on the chore list, but because I needed to test myself in daylight. The cedar stand looked smaller in the sun, less sacred, more practical. I found my own boot prints from yesterday by the gate and, farther upslope in damp needles, 2 deep impressions where something heavy had set weight and moved on. Not a full print, not clean mud, just enough to show depth and spacing. I put my boot beside one and felt the same quiet jolt I'd felt at the creek. Whatever made that mark carried mass, and placed it carefully. Mabel moved ahead with loose shoulders, then stopped at the cedar root bend and looked uphill again, ears relaxed. She did that little nose lift she used when greeting someone she liked. No barking, no stiffness, no warning rumble. I knelt, rubbed her chest and said, "Either you know more than me, or you're the worst guard dog in 3 counties. She licked my chin with complete confidence in her own job performance. I started leaving the gate to the pen unlatched during chores so I could step in and out quick. I also started talking out loud more than usual, half to keep myself steady and half because silence no longer felt empty. I'd set a bucket down and hear myself say, "I'm fixing the hinge today," as if giving a work report to trees. Once I caught myself saying, "Be right back," when I walked up to the shed for pliers. If anybody from the mill had seen me, they'd have filed paperwork. I laughed about it by myself, and the laugh did me good. That afternoon, a little after 3, my phone caught a bar near the woodpile, and I called my father. He answered on the first ring. "You all right?" he asked. "I don't know what to call it yet," I said. "You remember Grandad ever talking about seeing something up here?" Silence sat on the line long enough that I thought we'd dropped the call. Then he cleared his throat. "Not often," he said. "But once after your mother was born, he told me he was coming back to camp in sleet, and a bear came in, hot, near the old goat fence. Said something big stepped out of timber and stood between him and trouble. Never touched the bear, just stood there till it backed off. I leaned against split fur, knees weak for no physical reason. You believe him? I believed your granddad when he said grace, and when he said a board was true. Same kind of certainty in both. Why are you asking me this now, Trav?" I watched Mabel at the clearing edge, tail moving slow in the cold light. "Because I think I saw who he meant." My father let out a long breath I could hear through static. "Then keep your head clear. Don't chase. Don't crowd. Pay attention to your dog, and come home with yourself intact, hear me?" "I hear you. Call me tomorrow, whether anything happens or not." After we hung up, I stayed there with the phone in my hand, until the signal died. The crux of it settled plain in me then. I had spent years believing that if something could not be measured, it should be dismissed. Yet every practical thing in my life had been measured and still left me hollow. This was different, not an argument to win, not a story to sell. A presence meeting me on its own terms and asking only that I notice. By the 3rd morning after that call, I had stopped forcing explanations and started paying attention to patterns. At sunrise, the jays raised a fuss near the lower drawer, then went quiet all at once. 10 minutes later, Mabel gave one soft huff toward the slope and sat down like she was waiting for permission to begin the day. Near noon, I found 2 wind-fallen branches moved off the spur trail and set parallel, clearing the path where I usually carried grain. Too deliberate for weather, too heavy for me to think squirrel antics. I tested boundaries the way cautious men do. I set one red apple on the split rail post by the pen and went back up to patch flashing. When I returned before dusk, the apple was gone. In its place sat 3 late asters, stems aligned, purple heads facing uphill. No boot marks, no sign of disturbance beyond one deep toe impression in soft earth just outside the fence, angled away from camp. I stood there with my mouth half open and felt wonder move through me with the same steadiness as fear used to. Not a spike. A tide. That evening the temperature dropped fast, and a grey band of cloud climbed over the west ridge. I carried water from the catch barrel, chopped kindling, and kept glancing to the tree line with a kind of respectful expectation. Right before dark, while I was cinching a tarp line, I saw him again at the upper edge of the clearing, partly screened by cedar trunks. Full height this time, in open enough light that there was no room for mistakes. Dark fur with lighter weathered strands at the shoulders. Arms long, hands broad, posture balanced and calm. He watched me tie the line, then lowered his head once, slight as a nod, and stepped sideways into cover. No rush, no drama, no claim. Just acknowledgement. I raised my hand without thinking. "Evening," I said again, quieter than before. He paused, turned enough that one amber-brown eye caught the last light, and continued uphill. The woods settled around his passing like water closing after a boat. Sleet started just after full dark, tapping the stovepipe and ticking against the window glass in brief, hard bursts. I slept in short stretches, woke, listened, slept again. By late afternoon the next day the storm had turned meaner, needles of ice blowing sideways through the trees. I should have moved the grain earlier, but I'd spent too long wrestling a warped board onto the porch corner and lost daylight. Around dusk I hoisted the feed sack to my shoulder, grabbed the flashlight, and headed for the goat pen with Mabel at my knee. The trail was slick clay under a thin crust, and alder branches slapped wet against my jacket. At the cedar root bend, Mabel stopped dead, then trotted ahead fast, not panicked, just urgent. I rounded the last stand of young hemlock and heard brush break down slope in one violent rush. A lean black bear with a torn ear burst through the alder gap, head low, momentum all wrong for a casual pass. Mabel darted backward through the pen opening and hit the far corner, trapped by rails and her own fear. I shouted and reached for a rock, knowing it wouldn't be enough at that distance. Then the dark shape stepped out from the trees to my left and placed himself between the gate and the charge. He did not lunge. He did not strike. He widened his stance, angled his body so his shoulders filled the opening, and lifted his arms just enough to make his outline enormous. He gave one deep, steady exhale I felt in my chest more than heard, then drove a single, open-hand thump into the ground beside the rail. The impact shuddered through wet soil and wood. The bear checked hard, claws digging for purchase, swung its head once, and veered off in a spray of sleet and leaves toward the lower draw. Everything after that happened in sharp pieces. Mabel scrambled to me and shoved against my leg so hard she almost knocked me over. My flashlight dropped in mud. My knees hit the ground anyway. I was shaking from adrenaline, yes, but also from recognition so precise it took my breath. Same pen line, same sleet, same calm barrier between harm and what I loved. My grandfather had not told a fable to entertain a boy. He had handed me a map for a night like this. The big figure stayed at the fence line a moment longer, turning his head enough to check where the bear had gone, then looking back to me. Those eyes held steady, not human, not empty, not wild in the way people use that word when they mean cruel. Steady and kind. He lowered his arms, stepped to the split rail post and set something on top of it with careful fingers. When he moved back toward timber, I saw what he had left. A small braid of willow with 2 mountain asters tucked through it, purple gone dark in the sleet. He paused once at the cedar edge, shoulders outlined against the pale stormlight, then continued uphill until trunks and weather took him from sight. I stayed in the mud with Mabel pressed against my chest and the willow braid in my shaking hand, while the sleet softened to rain and the whole mountain breathed again. I stayed kneeling in the mud with Mabel braced against me, one arm around her chest and the willow braid clenched in my other hand so tight the stems pressed ridges into my palm. Rain tapped the rails, the sleet mostly spent, and my breath came in hard pulls that tasted like cold iron and wet cedar. I had spent years trying not to break in front of anyone, like tears were another unpaid bill I could keep shoving to next month, and there in that pen I folded all at once. Not loud, not dramatic, just a long, shaking release that started in my ribs and worked its way through me until my shoulders went weak. Mabel licked my wrist, then my jaw, then shoved her head under my chin like she was trying to hold me together from the outside. I pressed my forehead to hers and let it happen. I cried for my grandfather. I cried for the marriage I wore down one extra shift at a time. I cried because I had built my whole adult life around being dependable and hard to hurt, and a silent giant in the trees had just protected my dog with more composure than I had ever managed for myself. In that moment, I wasn't ashamed of crying. I was tired of being sealed shut. When I could stand, I stood slowly, knees stiff, jeans soaked through and heavy. I picked up the flashlight from the mud, wiped the lens on my sleeve, and swept the beam once toward the lower drawer where the bear had gone. Nothing but aldershine and rain threads in the light. I checked the rails, checked Mabel for cuts, checked the gate latch with hands that still trembled, because practical tasks are how I keep from drifting. She was scared but unhurt. The pen held. The storm was easing. I looked uphill to the cedar edge where he had disappeared and found only trunks, wet bark dark as coffee grounds, and the occasional drip letting go from high boughs. I put 2 fingers to the willow braid and said, quiet as I could, "Thank you." The words did not feel foolish this time. They felt overdue. By the time full dark settled in, I had gotten us back to the cabin, peeled off soaked layers by the stove, and rubbed Mabel down with the old green towel that used to hang by my grandfather's back door. She stood still for it, then shook once so hard her ears slapped my knee. I laughed through the leftover tightness in my throat and told her, "You picked a rough night to test my blood pressure." She sneezed in my direction and went straight to her blanket. I hung the willow braid over the mantel nail beside Granddad's pocket knife, not as decoration, just where I could see it plain. Rain ticked steadily on the roof. The stove heat came up slow and steady, smelling faintly of fir resin from the mystery stack under my tarp. I sat at the table with the notebook open and wrote everything as exact as I could. Weather, time by my watch, Bear's approach line through alder, his position between gate and charge, the ground thump, the retreat path, the braid placement. My handwriting went uneven when I got to the part about his eyes. I wrote that anyway. Then I stopped writing and sat with both hands around a mug of coffee gone lukewarm. Internal noise usually rushed in when I got still. That night, what came instead was a kind of clear ache. I remember thinking, I am here right now and I am not pretending. I'm scared and grateful at the same time. I am not crazy. I am not drunk. I saw what I saw. I felt my chest loosen another notch with each plain sentence in my head, like truth itself was a tool finally fitting the right bolt. I called my father because he had asked me to call whether anything happened or not. The signal by the woodpile held at 1 bar. wavering. He picked up on the second ring. "Trav?" "Yeah." "You sound wrung out." "I am. It happened again, at the goat pen." Bear came in fast, torn ear lean, moving like it meant business. He was silent for half a breath, then, "And?" "He stepped in, same way you said Grandad described. Didn't attack, just made himself bigger and held ground." Bear turned and ran. Rain hissed in the eaves while my father breathed on the line, rough and measured. "You and the dog okay?" "We're okay." "Then hear me. Lock up. Keep a clean camp. Call the warden in the morning about that bear, not about anything else. Some stories are for family and men who already know." I looked back through the window at the dim shape of Mabel asleep near the stove. "I know." His voice softened. "Your granddad would tell you to give thanks and keep your head level." "I already did both." "Good. Get some sleep, son." The line clicked dead. I stood by the woodpile with the phone in my hand until cold reached through my flannel and sent me inside. Sleep came in longer stretches than usual, and each time I woke, I listened without panic. Once near dawn, I heard a soft knock against the outer rail. Not sharp, just wood touching wood in the wet. And Mabel lifted her head, but did not bark. She thumped her tail twice and laid back down. I stayed on the cot and stared at the dark rafters, pulse calm, and understood that trust can arrive without permission when enough evidence stacks up in front of you. Morning came washed and silver. Low cloud dragged through the trees at shoulder height, and the clearing looked like it had been rubbed clean overnight. I brewed coffee, fed Mabel, and we walked to the pen in damp quiet. Fresh sign told the story in practical marks. The bear's clawed skid in mud by the alder gap, the pivot where it turned downslope, the deep-paired impressions near the fence where he had planted his stance. I placed my boot beside one, and it looked like a child's shoe by a snow shovel. Scale is one thing in memory, and another thing at your feet. I did what my father said. I called the district warden from the signal spot and reported a black bear charge near the old Thornton goat pen. Torn ear, late-season raiding behavior. No injuries. Bear diverted downslope. I kept my report plain and factual. The warden, Ellis Grant, said he'd had 2 feed shed complaints in the drainage and thanked me for the location and direction of travel. "I'll run the lower road this afternoon," he said. "Keep your dog close till we push him out, or trap him." That thread, at least, was tied where it needed to be. After the call, I went back to the split rail post. I had carried one of the dark river stones in my pocket all morning, thumb rubbing its edge while I worked up what I wanted to do. The willow braid still lay where I had set it to dry, stems holding shape, asters bruised but intact. I placed the dark stone beside the braid on the top rail, then set a second stone across it in the same crossed marker he had used on my stump. Safe trail. No trouble. Keep going. A reply and a promise both. The woods stayed quiet while I worked through midday chores. Not empty, just settled. Jays bickered and moved on. A squirrel lectured me from a branch, as if I owed him rent. Mabel followed me from shed to porch to woodrack, loose and easy, checking uphill now and then with that same calm expectation. Around 2, while I was splitting a short round by the rack, she stopped, lifted her head toward the north rise, and sat, tail sweeping once, twice. I lowered the maul and listened. A shape stood at the tree line above the clearing, partly in mist, partly in thin sun. He was farther than last evening, maybe 60 yards, broad shoulders framed between 2 fir trunks. He did not step closer. He did not gesture. He simply stood there long enough for me to see him clearly and settle my own breathing. In daylight, his fur showed dark brown under black, with weather-lightened streaks over the shoulders, and his posture held the same unhurried composure that had marked every encounter. Huge, yes, gentle first. I set the maul down on the chopping block and wiped my hands on my jeans. "She's all right," I said, nodding toward Mabel. "I'm all right too." He angled his head slightly, as if taking that in. Then he looked toward the pen trail, back to me, and shifted one step uphill. Not retreat exactly, more like yielding the shared ground back to me now that the urgent part was done. The resulting stillness carried no sadness. It felt like the end of a task completed by someone who never asked for thanks. I stood there with sawdust on my sleeves and tried to hold every detail without grabbing at any of it. I had chased control for years, at work, at home, in every conversation where I was scared to admit I was tired. And this required a different discipline. Witness, don't possess. Respect, don't pursue. My grandfather had understood that better than I did. I was learning late, but I was learning. He turned then, not abrupt, not theatrical, and moved into the timber with that same measured placement of weight I'd seen from the start. Branches bent and rose behind him. At one point he passed through a stripe of pale light, and I saw the full line of his back and shoulders. Then cedar shadow took him, and the mountain folded closed around his path. No farewell. No mystery staged for effect. Just quiet departure. Mabel remained seated another half-minute, watching the spot where he had vanished, then stood and came to lean against my leg. I rested my hand on her neck and looked at the crossed stones on the rail. The damp clearing, the cabin roof I had nearly sold, and the long slope beyond. Something in me that had been braced for years finally unclenched. He had come, he had protected, he had left, and none of it asked me to become a different man overnight. It only asked me to tell the truth and live worthy of it. That evening, with rain returning in a soft, steady sheet, I brought the willow braid inside and set it in Grandad's old tobacco tin, lined with clean cloth, then placed the tin beside his pocket knife on the mantel shelf, where heat from the stove would keep damp from taking it. I wrote down where it was stored and why, the way practical men catalogue important things. After supper, I opened the door one last time and listened to Coldwater Creek, speaking through the dark. The mountain gave no sign, no extra proof, no second performance. It didn't need to. I closed the door gentle, barred it, and slept with a kind of peace I'd forgotten my body could hold. I woke before dawn to rain easing off the roof in slow drips, not the hard sleet tap from the night before, and for a second I did not remember where I was in the story of my own life. Then I saw the tobacco tin on the mantel beside Grandad's pocket knife, and memory settled in with a steady weight I could carry. Mabel lifted her head, saw me watching her, and thumped her tail twice against the floorboards like she was clocking in for shift. By the time coffee finished, the eastern ridge had gone from charcoal to soft blue. I fed Mabel, pulled on boots still damp at the seams, and walked to the goat pen with the notebook under my arm. Fresh morning light made every mark plain. My kneel prints from the mud, bare skid at the alder gap, and those deep placements near the rail where he had stood and held. I sketched them again from a different angle, measured with a tape, wrote the numbers down, then shut the notebook and sat on the lower rail while Mabel sniffed the fence line. I remember that quiet thinking, clear as if it is still happening. I am not building a case. I am not trying to convince a room full of strangers. I am not putting this on a screen for applause. I am a tired man on wet boards, with a dog I love, and a chest that finally feels open enough to breathe through. The stacked wood, the untwisted snare, the asters where an apple had been, the pause at the cedar roots, the crossed stones, the step backward to give me room, the ground thump that turned a bear, the willow braid on the rail. All of it belongs to one pattern. Care, offered without demand. I had been calling the world empty because I was empty. That did not make it true. At 9, I got one bar by the woodpile and called Ellis Grant. He answered from his truck, engine hum under his voice. Grunt. It's Travis Thornton, up above Coldwater. I'm following up on yesterday. Good timing, he said. We pushed a tawny boar off the lower road at first light. Lean old raider, same one from 2 feed complaints. He crossed east over shale and kept moving. You did right calling it in. I looked toward the pen trail. Appreciate you getting up here. You and your hound still okay? We're okay. There was a pause, wind rattling his line. I'm 10 minutes from your spur if you want me to look at sign. Yeah, I said. Come on up. He arrived in a mud-splashed state truck just before 10. Broad-shouldered, grey moustache, the same old canvas hat he'd worn since I was a kid, stealing jerky from Grandad's pocket. We walked to the pen together. He crouched by the bare skid, touched claw grooves, nodded once. Then he moved to the deep impressions near the rail and stayed still longer than I expected. He did not put his hand in them. He did not photograph them. He looked, stood, and gave me a side glance that held more than surprise. That your boot? He asked, pointing at my print nearby. Yeah. He measured with his eyes again and straightened. Ground was soft last night. Weight carries different in weather. It was an answer and not one. I took a breath. Ellis, if I tell you the rest, you gonna write me up as exhausted? He took off his hat, wiped rain from the brim, set it back on. Travis, I've worked this drainage 32 years. I've learned there are reports for file cabinets and reports for men. You pick which one this is. So I told him. Not with flourishes, just sequence and detail, same as I would describe a machine failure at the mill. I told him about Mabel sitting calm at the tree line, the crossed stones on my stump, marker like Grandad's, dry fur stacked under tarp after rain, snare wire unwound and recoiled, the first full sighting by the cedar stand, the apple swapped for asters, the bear charge, the stance at the fence, the willow braid. Ellis listened with his chin down, eyes on the pen rail, and never once interrupted. When I finished, he let out a slow breath and looked uphill toward the cedars. Your granddad told me near this same spot, he said quietly. Different year, same weather mood, same torn-up way a man can be inside. I nodded then too. He tipped his head toward the rail where my crossed stones sat. Leave what you've left. Keep your camp clean. Don't invite fools up here chasing stories. Some things stay whole only if they stay quiet. I won't bring anyone. He gave me a brief, firm look. I know. Before he drove out, he wrote the bear action in his field pad where I could see relocated east drainage, no further incident, official thread tied. At the truck door he paused and added, Your dog trusted first. That matters more than folks think. Then he was gone down the ruts, tailgate rattling. By the second morning after Ellis came, clouds broke clean and sunlight reached the porch for the first time in days. I drove into town for supplies and met my father at the diner off Highway 12, the one with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that could strip paint. He was already there, hands around a mug, shoulders a little rounded with age I had been too busy to notice. When I sat down, he studied my face for a long second, then nodded like he had just set down a load he'd been carrying quietly. You look rested, he said. Bit, I said. First time in a while. We ordered eggs and hash, and for a minute we talked weather and chainsaw parts because men like us circle the runway before landing. Then he set his fork down. I should have said it years ago, he said. You kept taking those shifts and I called it work ethic when it was you drowning polite. I knew better. I stared at the ketchup bottle label until the words steadied. I should have said I was drowning. He gave a rough half smile. Family trait. Silence masquerading as toughness. Grandad did it too. Yeah, he said. Difference is he learned to come back out of it. Maybe you just did. I reached into my jacket and put the pale center stone on the table between our coffee cups. He touched it with one finger and looked up. From the marker, he asked. From the first one. He nodded once, eyes bright but steady. Then keep it. We sat in companionable quiet after that. Not empty quiet, working quiet, like two men repairing a fence line one post at a time. When the check came, he paid before I could reach, and when I objected, he said, "Let your old man win one." And I let him. That afternoon, parked beside the feed store with 2 bars of signal, I checked a voicemail from Dad that had come in while I was inside. Sunday dinner was set at his place for 6, and Leah was coming with pie and, in his words, the usual supervisory energy. I sat there smiling at the windshield for a minute, hearing how ordinary it sounded. Ordinary was what I wanted now. A table, family voices, no performance. Before I left camp that morning, I had already sent notice to the mill office that I was returning next week on straight shifts only, with no automatic overtime. I wrote it, plain and final, the way you mark a cut line before you commit a saw. No speeches, no negotiations, just a boundary in writing. When I returned to camp near dusk, the clearing held that washed gold light that makes cedar bark glow. I carried groceries in, stacked them, then took the tobacco tin from the mantel and opened it on the table. The willow braid had dried into a gentle curve, asters flattened but still faintly purple. I added the pale center stone beside it, wrapped both in a square of clean cloth, and wrote an inventory note on the inside lid in pencil. Willow braid, 2 asters, pale river stone from first marker, October. Then I set the tin back beside Grandad's pocket knife, exactly where heat stayed even. Outside I walked to the stump and found the 2 dark stones still crossed where I had left them. At the pen, the rail marker remained too, damp with evening dew. I did not add anything new. I just set my hand on the top post and stood there while Mabel ranged the grass and came back to lean against me. The mountain gave no final sign, no staged farewell. Birds settled, creek spoke below. Wind moved through fir crowns in long, patient breaths. I said a prayer out loud, simple and unpolished, the first one in years that did not feel like static. Gratitude for shelter, for my dog, for my grandfather's stubborn kindness, for protection freely given, for another chance to live different. Then I went inside, latched the door and lay down with a quiet mind. I kept the land. I repaired the porch corner, replaced the last bad shingles before snow, and left the goat pen gate true on its hinges. I told the full story only to my father and Ellis Grant, who already carried versions of it in their own lives. Leah got the honest part she needed through Dad. I was healing and I was coming home for supper. Marty never claimed the wood, and I believed him. The strange details never turned into explanations, and I stopped requiring them to. What I carried forward was simpler and harder. I was seen on a mountain when I had stopped seeing myself, and I was protected without being asked to perform strength first. For a man built on labor and denial, that was a mercy big enough to rebuild a life around.